Hello, Assalamu alaikum. We are Canada Maple Foundation's Youth Leadership Group. My name is Iza Khatoon.
And my name is Tuba Khan.
And today we'll be talking about climate change and whether we are going into an ice age.
We should start by defining what exactly climate change is. Now, the term refers to long-term shifts in global patterns and global temperatures. Now, while these temperature shifts have usually been natural in the past, starting from the 1800s, we've noticed increasing upticks due to human activity, which is usually due to the burning of fossil fuels, oils, and greenhouse gases. Now, let's talk about greenhouse gases. Can you please explain what exactly they are and the effect they have on us?
Sure. So greenhouse gases are basically gases in the Earth's atmosphere that trap heat. During the day, the sun shines through the atmosphere, warming the Earth's surface, and at night, when the Earth cools, it releases heat back into the air. But some of the heat is trapped by the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And because of that, the Earth's temperature sort of varies around 14 degrees Celsius. The primary greenhouse gases which are natural, are carbon dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, and methane, as well as water vapor, which is the most abundant. And the man-made ones that are produced from industrial processes are fluorinated gases. So now that we know about greenhouse gases, what are the consequences?
See, it's hard to exactly measure the consequences as of yet. All we can do is predict, because to measure the consequences, we need long-term data, and we don't have that. Yet we can't exactly wait around, as we're already starting to notice the long-term consequences, such as the debilitation of biomes and ecosystems. For example, in both of the poles, we've noticed due to melting glaciers, lots of animal species are close to extinct. They're losing their habitat. And due to the glacier water melting into the ocean, we're noticing significant rises in sea levels and coastlines, which also means coastal cities like Tokyo, Florida are going to be quite submerged, like at least halfway underwater by 2050 even. And that means that there's going to be coastline infrastructure, which is heavily damaged. So a lot of people are going to also have to relocate. And due to overpopulation problems, that's going to be quite hard to fit in. Due to rising sea levels, we've noticed that there's going to be a complete destabilization of coastal cities and the infrastructure. So basically, once a city like Tokyo is submerged in water, we're going to have to relocate its population and plan for future generations. And because of overpopulation problems, that's going to be quite a difficult task, as so much of tourism, entertainment industry, they're kind of built along this concept of beach cities. So we're going to have to completely rethink that, because Florida is already like 10% submerged underwater already.
Yeah, and it's a really big economic loss for those cities, especially due to the fact that Tokyo has a really big population.
Exactly, yeah. I also heard something about axis shifting due to sea levels rising.
That's right.
Could you please explain that a bit more?
Sure. So basically, the addition to climate change that humans are causing, which is the rise of sea levels from high temperatures due to greenhouse gases, those glacier melting and the usage of groundwater resources has increased sea levels never seen before. And because of that, the water is a really big mass. And when there's more water going into seas, there's a big movement of a big mass of water. So think of it like putting water in a basin and then moving it around. You can feel that pressure of water. And because of that, scientists have sort of proved that that water movement is slightly tilting the axis.
So what are the consequences of that?
Along with rising sea levels, tsunamis, hurricanes, all those disasters, those will increase. And if there is, and in the grand scheme of things, obviously, if there's a slight tilt in the axis, we're only going to have, let's say, a few more milliseconds added to a day, 24 hours.
And over time, it adds up.
Yeah. But if there's an extreme tilt, we can get to the point where the North Pole and the South Pole are basically switched. Or even worse, they're just on the other side of the Earth. And at one point, you can have one side of the Earth, so the northern hemisphere, facing the sun for 6 months on end.
Oh.
And that could be good and bad. So when the northern hemisphere is facing the sun for almost half a year, there will be a lot of plant growth on that side. Animals will take advantage of the extra sunlight. However, us human beings will not thrive as well as plants will, because we depend on a day and night routine.
Yeah.
And that extra sunlight for months on end can actually lower our melatonin levels, which helps us sleep, which helps us manage stress, all of that. And it can cause a lot of disorders and depression and stuff like that.
I hear it messes with like your circadian rhythm too, right?
That's right, yeah.
So it's funny how you mention the benefits for the northern hemisphere, when isn't it also true that because of the sunlight facing the northern hemisphere, there's going to be a lot of like dark and cold in the southern hemisphere? So what are the negative impacts of that?
So the other half of the Earth will not be facing the sun for half a year, and that will cause a lot of imbalance. So there will be mass extinctions as well, because animals obviously can't live in that type of weather. They need, they need several habitats. They need a coexisting system. So apart from that, plant growth will completely become abolished.
So I think it's really interesting how you talk about both sides of the extreme, because I feel like it's a really common myth that people have that when global warming happens, temperatures are just going to rise and get warmer. But that's not true at all, is it? I've heard of things like extreme tsunamis, tundras. Explain that.
Yeah, so it's really just how the position of every location is on Earth. They're going to have different effects, just like you said previously with the coastal cities. They're going to experience flooding. Apart from that, areas near coastal cities can also have higher chances of experiencing hurricanes, because hurricanes basically they extract energy from the sea, and if the sea is at a warmer temperature, or if there's more water being added in sea levels, then there's a bigger probability that there will be more hurricanes with higher damage.
And I hear the instability of such climate is also hazardous for lots of ecosystems.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, all animals depend on a specific habitat where they're attracted and where they adapt to certain environments. And if there's an extreme shift in environment or temperatures, they won't be able to adapt or evolve really quickly, and eventually it'll end in their extinction.
And we do have lots of like examples of recent climate crisis, don't we?
That's right.
Like there's been heat waves in Turkey, floodings in Pakistan, fires in Australia. Tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, since the 1990s, actually, although the Industrial Revolution had a really big effect on our global warming, or climate change as we call it, it's been more effective since starting the 1990s, because that's when our industries boomed. Our factories would have more contribution to greenhouse gases, and since then we've had a lot more climatic crises all around the world. And it's kind of surprising to know that Pakistan being only contributing to 1% of the gas emissions in the world, yet it's the 8th most vulnerable nation to all these climate crises.
I think that's really interesting, because oftentimes we make global warming and climate crisis as if it's a problem that's equally contributed to by everybody. But when you really look into it, that's not exactly accurate, is it?
Not at all.
We can talk about reuse, recycle, thrifting, recycling, but at the end of the day, the biggest impact on climate crises and global change is 100 or so corporations that contribute the most to it. And so when we talk about that, we also have to talk about the government and their accountability in this crisis, right?
That's right.
Which leads into, I've heard many conspiracies actually, like I think it was the HARP conspiracy, which has been a really recent one.
Right, yeah.
I heard you know a lot about that, so what exactly is the HARP conspiracy?
Basically, before HARP was an actual technology that people brought into conspiracy theories, it was considered a research program where they would study the ionosphere of the Earth. So they would send radio waves to the ionosphere, which would then reflect the radio waves back, and then they would study the different data collection that they received from it. But now apparently people are calling it a conspiracy theory. They believe that the U.S. government or other big governments of the world are using that technology to alter climate, alter the climate.
But on what scale would this project be able to affect the overall global climate, though? And what truth is there to the conspiracy?
Once again, we don't have the right data to it because even if it is true, they've kept it pretty hidden from the public. But from what I know so far is that that technology could have the ability to cause hurricanes or earthquakes or any kind of climatic disaster, just like that.
On one hand, there's the idea that why would the U.S. government intentionally cause these climate crises when it's just going to go against their own population? They're going to have to pick up on that. It's bad for everyone. But on the other hand, there are people who think that they're weaponizing this project against other countries as a political weapon to further their agenda. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that's a really big possibility because in the end, although their globalization has caused many partnerships between countries, it's also caused, it's also had given a reason for countries to protect themselves and, bring around barriers between other countries. And it comes with the U.S. wanting to be the higher power, including China, Russia. They all want a really big chunk of power from this world. So having this kind of weapon, higher powers could possibly use this against other countries.
It's definitely a possibility considering what they have done in the past.
Yeah, that's right. So talking about all these horrifying things, it's really concerning, and it makes me think what as individuals and as a community we can do to help reduce climate change.
Well, let me tell you what we can do. Well, obviously there's a limit to what each individual person can do, but I think the mindset that, I'm just one person, whatever I do won't really help is quite toxic, because once everybody starts to think like that, we're not going to get anywhere. So I think the first step is for each individual to recognize that you're a part of this planet, you live here, and you have a responsibility to it.
As a global citizen.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And now we can start to talk about some of the ways in which you can incorporate helping the planet in your everyday life. So one of the most obvious things that we've always learned as children is reuse, recycle, and reduce. So for example, thrifting, recently it's become really popular in social media as well.
That's right.
And avoiding this maximalist subculture where you have to have the newest fast fashion brands, clothing, newest furniture. Actually, a lot of entertainment industries, fashion industries promote their products as being ethical or eco-friendly, but that's not really true. And most of the clothes end up in landfills where they're burned in factories that release even more carbon emissions. So I think to start off, we need to focus on more sustainable lifestyles, starting with our clothing and everyday use of materials. That also goes into our transportation methods. For example, if we take a car to work every day in the morning and evening, think about the emissions from that alone. And I do want to point out that it is a lifestyle choice. So there's lots of things that can be done, like biking to work, carpooling, taking the train. Also, our use of energy, electricity, heating, and gas. So Canada is actually the top annual energy consumer in the world, which just sounds crazy, I know. But a way to reduce your energy emissions is by wearing sweaters in the winter, turning your heat down, stop using so much electricity. Not only is it costly for your bills, but it's also bad for the environment.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, we can unplug computers, TVs, things like that. And I think it's not only good for the environment, but it's good for your social life as well, because I feel like in the modern day, we're so wrapped up in our electronics and digital way of life. So I think disconnecting from that and focusing more on what's in front of you is a big factor.
Definitely, yeah. It'll contribute a lot to mental health, and it'll help us realize as global citizens how much we need to be involved just like you said earlier.
And speaking of being involved as global citizens, I think it's important to start mentioning awareness and what we can do as a collective, as a community to fight climate change. So I have heard about taking action as a community, speaking out, lobbying, boycotts. Can you explain that a bit more on what we can do to urge the government and as a community overall?
Yeah, so the thing that you mentioned about fast fashion was really interesting. I think as a community, we can start boycotting fast fashion, and that will make a really big effect on, all those clothes that end up on the landfill. Another thing is getting in touch with and communicating with federal parties. And one thing that we take for granted is living in a democracy, and having the freedom of speech can make a really big difference when it comes to getting the government to make urgent action against climate change. And I know for a fact that recently Canada has started reducing carbon emissions in one of their climate plans.
They have. So
Yeah.
it's actually set to be implemented by 2030. We're not exactly like caught up on the goal yet.
Yeah.
And I think it needs to be addressed, the lack of accountability
Yeah.
that has been faced with the government. I mean, since the 1900s, our global emissions have risen 20% in just Canada alone, despite the promise of reducing emissions by 2030. So can you explain a bit more about why that might be, why there isn't urgent action being taken at the moment, despite the pressing concerns we face?
Yeah, I think it's the fact that, apart from the fact that Canada is, contributing to a lot of carbon emissions, it has also scientifically proven to increase the global temperature by 2 degrees Celsius, which is a really big...
Just us?
Yes,
Wow.
just us alone. And it's crazy because if you compare Canada's population with the population of California, it's less than California's population. And the fact that we're contributing to such a massive change in climate, it's crazy. It's beyond understanding.
And we mentioned this earlier, but it isn't just the citizens of Canada who implement this. It's also corporations that have been left unchecked for far too long. So we mentioned lobbying earlier on. So do you think that there should be a pressure on the government to companies in terms of reducing carbon emissions?
Yeah, I know that Canada is taking action now more so than before, because they're actually listening to people, and their voices are being heard. There's a lot of climate activists that have actually made a really big change.
So do you think humanity will live long enough to go to other planets in the solar system? And if not, how do you think we're going to deal with the climate crisis? Say it happens, worst case scenario. How will we adapt to it on Earth?
I know that there are a lot of civilizations around Earth that are more capable of evolving to extreme climate change, and it really just depends on our adaptability, and it depends on our strength to keep going. And if you've seen movies like Elysium, for example, we just know that it's always the 1% rich that end up in a safer place outside of Earth. Yeah.
I mean, there are things that are being taken into account for worst case scenarios. I know there are reserves. So in a lot of parts of the world, there's bunkers, and inside these bunkers, there's seeds. And so they hide and preserve seeds in case of agricultural crises. And I feel like that's really beneficial. But right now, a big topic of discussion is colonizing other planets for ensuring the survival of humanity as a whole. I know SpaceX and other companies are looking into that. What do you think of that?
I mean, at this point, we know that in our solar system, the only capable planet for us, or most closely capable, is Mars. And Elon Musk did start his SpaceX program to see if we can colonize Mars to the point where we would be able to live as a multiplanetary species. So both, living in Mars and Earth at the same time.
But like you mentioned before, isn't it that only the rich, top 1%, will actually get access to these? And even then,
seems like it.
Colonizing other planets seems like worst case scenario. It seems like almost like a plot hole, to be honest. Because it's like, let's just abandon our planet and go to another planet. I think it's not going to happen in our lifetime for sure. So shouldn't there be a focus on preserving our own planet rather than government action being taken in to colonize other planets?
Yeah, I mean, they're doing both. And, you're right, that is worst case
Yeah.
scenario, colonizing Mars. But at the end, we do feel the need to preserve our planet. So, like you said, a lot of governments are taking action against climate change. They're boycotting and lobbying against a lot of big corporations. And there's also a really big factor of GMOs, because we do know that agriculture is going to have a really big hit with all this climate change.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of GMOs. There's a lot of seeds that they've reserved in case of that.
I hear they're doing a lot of research on lab-grown meat. Yeah, it's so odd,
so
is it
cool.
not? So they take cells and things like that.
Yeah.
So the biggest problem with meat reproduction is obviously the price of it.
Mm-hmm.
So back in 2020, it was when the official research project started.
Mm-hmm.
They're actually doing research into lab-grown meat and artificial flavoring and things like that,
Mm-hmm.
because we all know that humans, we're not going to give up meat anytime soon. So maybe an easier substitute would be to have these artificial flavors, which would make plant-based lifestyles easier.
Mm-hmm. And I guess that also skips a lot of steps in the supply chain area,
Yeah.
where because of all these meat factories producing so many meat for people to eat, there's going to be less, contributions to greenhouse gases that way. So instead of just having the chickens or any kind of meat transported to industries, and those industries breaking down that to process into, edible food, we'll just have lab-grown meat. So it just
Yeah.
comes in, I guess.
So obviously this is just speculation. We can't exactly make concrete comments on the long-term effects of climate change. But I think from here on out, we all need to focus on personal accountability and what we each can do to help the planet. So yeah, it's been fun.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for being here. So this is Tuba Khan and
Iza Khatun, and thank you so much for listening.